Tonight, before we get started, as usual, let me walk through our remaining speakers. On May 11th, Brian Wills will be speaking on Inglorious Passages, Non-Combat Deaths in the Civil War. We've added a June call, a June session, since we're all on Zoom and it really doesn't matter if people have dispersed, so people can call in. Our speaker is going to be Dan Welch, who's a park ranger at Gettysburg, who's going to speak on the actions of General George Greene and his New York Brigade at Culp's Hill on the night of July 2nd and 3rd. Now, that's an action little known or lesser known than the one at Little Round Top earlier that day, but just as important in maintaining the Union position at Gettysburg. So it should be a really interesting talk. As with all of our Zoom sessions, we ask that you stay on mute while the speaker presents. If you have questions, use the chat function. You can write those in, and then at the end, I'll be going through those with Frank. Tonight's speaker, we have with us Frank O'Reilly. He's one of our favorite speakers. This is Frank's 7th appearance at the Roundtable since 2002. That makes him our second most frequent speaker after Ed Bars. Frank is lead historian at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. And tonight he's going to be speaking on Malvern Hill, Retreat from Victory, which I believe is his first talk to us that doesn't cover, at least in part, events within the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania Military Park. Frank, I'll turn it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. John, Mark, I'm really absolutely delighted to be here with you tonight. I appreciate everybody showing up tonight, and it's great to see you all, even if just on a screen. It speaks highly of your roundtable that you have such a great community that literally goes around the globe, and that's really quite an honor to you. It's easy to see why I love you guys so much. I will tell you right up front that I might have sound effects going on here that I did not anticipate. I have a 130-pound dog right in front of my desk, and he's fallen asleep and is already snoring. And so he's already anticipated my talk. So if you hear snoring, that's probably my dog. I'll apologize for that. So tonight we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects outside of the Fredericksburg area, and that is to look at the Battle of Malvern Hill. And I titled this Malvern Hill, A Retreat from Victory. Next slide. Because this is one of those bizarre battles where clearly one side wins and the other side benefits from calling it a victory. Next slide. I gather we haven't had a chance to talk much about the 7 days battles with your roundtable. So we're going to do just a tiny little bit of it. The 7 days battles around Richmond, as most of you are all familiar with, marked the emergence of General Robert E. Lee as commander of a force that was soon galvanized into the genesis of a hard-fighting unit that became known as the Army of Northern Virginia. But in the 7 days battles, I will tell you that Lee was not particularly happy with the progress of his own campaign. He tried by driving Union forces off the doorstep of Richmond by striking at their vulnerable right flank above the Chickahominy River at the top of your map, trying to unhinge the Union line and drive it backwards and threaten its supply base on the Chickahominy. But his plans were far too elaborate, and he expected to create complex combinations of forces trying to concentrate literally at the point of attack. And that failed repeatedly for him. It failed on June 26th at the Battle of Mechanicsville, which you see just above Robert E. Lee. It failed again the next day at Gaines Mill, June 27th, which you can see immediately to the right of that. But next slide. Fortunately for Robert E. Lee, his opponent was George B. McClellan. Now, McClellan was a soldier who was particularly gifted at siegecraft, but wasn't nearly as skilled at being a battlefield commander or battlefield manager. George McClellan feared that his attenuated line um, north of the Chickahominy River was vulnerable, and he felt that if the Confederates struck north of the river, that it would easily either gobble up his right or threaten to capture his entire supply base. Um, he decided to retreat by driving his forces from north to south across the Virginia Peninsula and try to seek shelter with the U.S. Navy on the James River, or as he more euphemistically put it, changing his base to the James River. Now, as Union forces abandoned their positions north of the Chickahominy and moved southward across this map from top to bottom, um, Robert E. Lee altered his plans pretty dramatically. Everything that he had done north of the Chickahominy at Mechanicsville, at Gaines Mill, was all based off of trying to drive the Union Army backwards, force it to fall back. But south of the Chickahominy, Robert E. Lee stepped up his pressure, looking with a new emphasis not on defending Richmond so much as annihilating George McClellan, trying to destroy his forces before they got to the sanctuary of the James River. Unfortunately for Robert E. Lee, the Confederates immediately south of the Chickahominy, which you'll see immediately to the right of Lee's picture, is a force that was led by John Bankhead Magruder. He failed to pin down the Federal forces opposite him at Savage Station on June 29th, and Union forces proceeded to continue to fall back, falling further and further south. Next slide. It's going to be a blow up of the bottom part of that map, and that is to look at the battle at Glendale on June 30th, 1862. June 30th promised a lot for Robert E. Lee, but it wound up delivering him only mistakes and disaster. 11 Confederate divisions were supposed to converge on Glendale and cut the one and only retreat route south to the James River. Of the 11 divisions that were put on the road, only 2 of them were engaged at Glendale. Stonewall Jackson, as you can see at the top of the map, was abruptly stopped unexpectedly at the White Oak Swamp and traded artillery fire with Sumner and Franklin's forces. Benjamin Huger was tentative and lost at best and managed to successfully miss everything, coming down just to the right of Jackson's forces. Magruder was supposed to come in right behind James Longstreet, but as he started marching in that direction, at the very bottom of the Confederate line, you can see Holmes, or Theophilus Holmes, who managed to get into a tussle right outside of a place called Malvern Hill. Magruder wound up marching to his aid, only to find that Holmes preferred to disengage rather than push forward, and then turned around to help out with Longstreet. Going back and forth, Magruder managed to successfully miss all of the action on June 30th. So Lee's plan to destroy McClellan on June 30th utterly failed. Next slide. Robert E. Lee was deeply upset by the results of June 30th. He was not only upset, he was sick, he was frustrated, he was angry as a result of how things had fared for that one day. In fact, at one point, Lee even snapped at a brand new brigade commander who joined him that day, Jubal Early. When Jubal Early wondered aloud if McClellan might escape the Confederates, Lee answered rather irritably to him, "Yes, he will get away, because I cannot get my orders carried out." Lee's desire to damage McClellan before he escaped translated into a combination of false optimism and sheer desperation on July 1st, 1862. false optimism in that while the Union Army had retreated, they had dumped a tremendous amount of their supplies along the route to lighten their load. The Confederates, gathering this largesse in, assumed that this was the sign of a demoralized force that was on the brink of destruction. Maybe just one more push might have sealed the deal for Lee after all. But it's also desperation when they realized it was only a couple of miles to the James River and the US Navy. July 1st, that optimism and desperation translated into a battle that should have never been fought. It was the battle at Malvern Hill. Ironically, it was a battle that the Confederates won almost in spite of themselves. And
Malvern Hill.
And one that they would rue for the rest of their lives. Early on the morning of July 1st, Lee met with his generals at the Willis Church, which is shown in the sketch in the middle here. And there he met with the folks that you see around him. Robert E. Lee met with John Bankhead Magruder, with Stonewall Jackson, with James Longstreet, D.H. Hill, and A.P. Hill. Now, in this meeting on that morning, he didn't propose very elaborate plans for an attack so much as he focused more on trying to get the movements of his army heading in the same direction to pursue the Union Army. D.H. Hill had been tipped off by a local minister named L.W. Allen that if the Union Army made a stand further south, maybe it would be best for the Confederates to stay clear of that. He offered to the other generals that if General McClellan is at Malvern Hill in strength, we better leave him alone. James Longstreet joked with the generals and teased D.H. Hill specifically by saying, "Don't get scared now that we have him, now that we've got him whipped." Hoping again that maybe the Union Army was too demoralized to make a sufficient stand even in a good defensive position. Next slide. Now, as Lee was talking about movements, he was hoping to get his forces to go from the area around Glendale, which you can see located in the center of the map, right by the picture of John Bankhead Magruder. And then at the bottom of the map, you will see the name Morrell, which is a Union division in the 5th Corps, and it is sitting at the junction of two roads, one called the Willis Church Road, the other called the Carter's Mill Road. And that junction is Malvern Hill. So the Confederates only have to get from the picture of John Bankhead Magruder to the block noted as Morrell. Lee went over the map and directed his division commanders on how on their individual routes and how they were supposed to get to Malvern Hill. Jackson would lead the way down the Willis Church Road itself. But unfortunately, as you can see from the inset, that road was called the Quaker Road on Lee's map. And that was based off an 1853 Robert P. Smith C. Carpenter map of Henrico County, Virginia. So it has the wrong name on it. It was the name that Lee gave it, even though the locals all knew it as the Willis Church Road. That would come back to haunt the Confederates pretty quickly. Jackson was supposed to move down that road. It was pretty easy for him to figure that out because he was standing at the Willis Church on the Willis Church Road. All he has to do is turn south and go. John Bankhead Magruder was simply supposed to follow Jackson until he got to the junction of those, the road with the Carter's Mill Road, and then extend Jackson's right. Delphus Holmes, at the bottom of your map, was supposed to move further on towards the Union Army using the River Road, guarding Richmond and threatening the Union retreat route to the river itself. James Longstreet and A.P. Hill, their commands were going to remain in reserve this day. They had bore the heavy fighting at Glendale the previous day and sustained pretty heavy losses. So this was going to be a day for the other troops to pick up the heavy lifting. However, Lee did ask James Longstreet to personally come forward with him and help him on the field as his second in command. Next slide. George B. McClellan also met with his subordinates on the morning of July 1st, 1862, atop Malvern Hill. And you can see that in a fairly glorified sketch right there in the middle. He didn't spend an awful lot of time with his generals. In fact, no sooner had he talked to them about holding that position for the day than he abruptly left. He got on a gunboat and went down the James River looking for a suitable base for his army and had his eye on a place called Harrison's Landing. McClellan had fixated on establishing a new base on the James River, and he left his army literally on the highest piece of ground north. But in doing so, McClellan neglected to delegate someone to command in his absence. Now, Fitzjohn Porter, shown in the upper right, was nominally in command of the front line. It was his troops that held that junction of two roads at Malvern Hill. But he wasn't the senior commander on the field. Edwin Vos Sumner, lower left, and Samuel P. Heinzelman, lower right, both were senior to Fitzjohn Porter. They were holding reserve positions to his right and rear, and they were ordered, or were expected, I should say, to cooperate with Fitzjohn Porter, which is a pretty dangerous supposition, especially when you consider there could be combat. McClellan may have appeared to have been very cavalier about all of this, but he really expected to hold Malvern Hill only for one day. And he expected his base needed to last significantly longer than that, which he felt required his personal attention and also his genius for engineering talents. Next slide. Malvern Hill was not very far south of Glendale. It's only about 3 miles. And the Federals filed into their defensive position by mid-morning on July 1st. The hill itself did not look particularly imposing, as you can see from the Walton Tabor sketch at the top. The hill formed a plateau on its northern face, didn't offer too much in the way of a deterrent against attack. It didn't appear to be much of a hill to speak of from this direction. But this hill was, in fact, pretty vital to McClellan's army. It offered some very commendable defensive features in spite of what it looks like in that sketch. Next slide. The southern end of Malvern Hill, the part that looks towards the James River, had a very steep bluff on it. So Malvern Hill really got its name not from the direction the Confederates were coming from, but the direction of the James River behind the Union lines. As you can see from this sketch, you could see the James River very clearly from the top of Malvern Hill. And if the Confederates held this position, they would have dominated the Union retreat route down to the river itself, which could have spelled disaster. Next slide. Though the northern end of the Malvern Hill, which is where you see Union forces closest to the Confederates, was not perceptibly high. It wasn't a particularly big hill in that sense. It was still very significant. It had a gentle, almost imperceptible slope to it that offered an unobstructed open field of fire that was ideal for artillery. There were wide open tracks on this battlefield that the artillery could take advantage of the open ground. And this was primarily composed of 5 different farms. The Malvern House, which appears at the bottom of the map, was the largest of the area buildings and thus gave its name to the hill. Closer up in towards the Union line was the Crew House, which appears off to the Union left flank, also known as Dr. J.M. Mettert's farm in some of the Union accounts. To the right of that is the West Farm, which you'll see right by Couch's name. Thomas I. West owned that farm. Up above where the Confederates are forming is the Moses H. Carter Farm, and also the Poindexter Farm, where Stonewall Jackson's troops are located. The other thing that's significant about this is the shape of the Union line. It's not straight. It's bulged with the center pushed out towards the Confederates. This is a salient, and inherently salients are difficult to defend because of the ability of defenders to wrap around it and concentrate their fire. But the Union Army went with this salient because of two other big features. On the right-hand side of your map is a stream, and on the left-hand side of your map is a stream. Western Run on the right by Turkey Island, and on the left is Turkey Run, which isn't near Turkey Island. So the odd part of this is Turkey Run is on the west, but Western Run is on the east by the Turkey. I don't pretend to understand why that is, but that is what it was. So these streams actually wound up compelling the Union Army to bend to the terrain, but the streams also wound up protecting both flanks because they were swamps. Now, McClellan hoped to hold this position for just one day, and he hoped that he would be able to do it without a battle. After 6 days of fighting, he had to admit that he and his troops were both exhausted. Worn out and war-worn is the way he put it. He told the Adjutant General of the Army, "I dread the results if we are attacked today by fresh troops." McClellan complained to his wife that he was dead with exhaustion at this point. Next slide. The Confederates almost helped McClellan achieve his goal without having a contest on July 1st. Like I said, it's only 3 miles between Glendale and Malvern Hill. It was easy for the Union Army to find it, but it proved to be much more difficult for the Confederates to get there. Their march to Malvern Hill was an absolute shambles. Stonewall Jackson, who had been notoriously torpid and slow and out of place all throughout the 7 days, was actually the only one who was in the place he was supposed to be that day. Woke up with a reinvigorated spirit that today they were going to do something, and was holding himself personally accountable for that. He reached his destination without any difficulty and managed to get all the way down the Willis Church Road opposite the Union forces under Morrell. But the other divisions that were supposed to come down that way under John Bankhead Magruder and Benjamin Huger got absolutely lost. Huger's division wound up splitting in two. Two of his brigades under Lewis Armistead and Ambrose Ransom Wright wound up finding their own way to the front by using unmarked woods roads just to avoid the traffic jam on the Willis Church Road. They wound up coming down the Carter's Mill Road and getting right into the position that they should have been in right from the start. The rest of their division didn't do nearly as well. Huger's last two brigades under William Mahone and Robert Ransom literally stayed in camp until it was James Longstreet who sent them a message telling them the road at Glendale was free of Union troops and that they should start marching. It was kind of a wake-up call after the fact that the Union Army had gotten away. He wound up getting caught in the traffic jam around Glendale, and Huger's last two brigades literally plotted in the rear echelon traffic, trying to get to the battlefield. Magruder's performance was even worse. It was absolutely appalling on July 1st. Now, John Bankhead Magruder was sick on July 1st. He had a nervous stomach, and apparently had relieved some of that by taking opiates to settle it. Those ministrations very well may have clouded his judgment and certainly muddled his ability to command on July 1st. Other than that, I'll be honest, Magruder's actions simply defy any kind of logic to me at all. John Bankhead Magruder engaged 3 local guides out of his command, people that had been raised in this area, and told them that he wanted to march down the Quaker Road. Now remember, the Quaker Road was the name of the Willis Church Road. Unfortunately, he didn't offer his guides any kind of context of where they were supposed to go or what they were trying to achieve, or even their destination, or that they just simply needed to follow Stonewall Jackson. Also unfortunate was that there was indeed another Quaker Road in the area. If you look down just below John Bankhead Magruder's picture, you will see the word SCWRT, which, just to show you how confusing this area is locally pronounced Darby. And you will see immediately beside that a Quaker Road. That Quaker Road does not go to Malvern Hill. It goes away from Malvern Hill. To make things even more interesting, General Longstreet was looking over the battlefield at Malvern Hill, and he found Magruder personally reconnoitering near the Carter's Mill Road, which is pretty close to where you see Benjamin Huger's picture. And he also spotted Magruder's column heading in the wrong direction, heading away from there. How ironic it was that John Bankhead Magruder was personally in the right place, but his command was not. Longstreet suggested to Magruder at that point that he should redirect his troops back to the battlefield, but Magruder, for whatever reason, dug his heels in and refused unless Longstreet gave him a direct order to do that. Longstreet hesitated at that point. He didn't have the confidence to do that because Magruder had talked to Lee at a point where Longstreet wasn't present. So since he was a person who had talked to Lee, Longstreet had to let him go. Next map. Meanwhile, Lee started to concentrate part of his army north of Malvern Hill, as you can see with the red blocks here, focusing largely around that intersection of the Willis Church Road and the Carter's Mill Road, around what is noted as a parsonage. That is Reverend Oscar Littleton's parsonage, and that was associated directly with the Willis Church. Jackson's forces formed a line pretty late in the morning on the Edwin Poindexter farm, which you can see up top right. Lee met with James Longstreet, and then the generals split up to reconnoiter the field together, or separately, I should say. Longstreet went to look at the Confederate right, and that's where he ran into John Bankhead Magruder on the Carter's farm. Lee looked further to the left, beyond Jackson's flank, looking to see if he could turn the Union right flank. Now, either James Longstreet or more likely Lewis Armistead, shown here, thought the Carter farm made an excellent artillery position, and that it would have been a platform that could handle what they guessed 40 to 60 cannon. And either Longstreet or Stonewall Jackson, or possibly even Robert E. Lee, saw the Poindexter farm to the right could accommodate even more, up to almost 100 cannon, they thought. So Lee cut off his reconnaissance without ever locating McClellan's right flank. Lee and Longstreet compared their notes and determined to focus their efforts on a grand battery to batter the salient. Lee was going to mass guns at both the Carter farm and at the Poindexter farm and destroy the tip of McClellan's salient. Once they were able to neutralize it, the infantry could roll forward and seize the high ground. Lee's chief of staff, Robert Chilton, who's shown here on the right, drafted Lee's attack order, and it was probably one of the worst written orders of the war. Let me read this to you because the words are important and significant. These are the attack orders for July 1st, 1862. Batteries, have been established to act upon the enemy's line. If it is broken, as is probable, Armistead, who can witness the effects of the fire, has been ordered to charge with a yell. Do the same. Signed, R.H. Chilton, Assistant Adjutant General. So there's a lot of things wrong with this order. Number one, who's the person who determines whether they're going to launch an infantry attack at Malvern Hill? It's not Robert E. Lee. It's not James Longstreet or Stonewall Jackson. It's Lewis Armistead, a brand new brigade commander. So the entire fate of this operation is in the hands of a brigade commander, a brigadier, rather than an army commander. And that's abdicating a tremendous amount of responsibility. And then there is the trigger for launching this attack. Armistead will decide when to make the attack, and when he does, he will attack with a yell. The yell is supposed to be the signal for a general assault all across the front, as if several hundred men yelling at the top of their lungs in the middle of a battle would be easily heard all across the Confederate lines. It's, for all the complexity of Lee's operations up to this point, this one is far to the other extreme of being so simple it can't work. But that was the order that was put out. The other thing that's a problem with this order is that it didn't have a timestamp. So nobody knew when it was written. Even today, we're guessing that it was written probably about 1 p.m., but we can't verify that. We can't say that for certain. So after Chilton gives us this marvelous display of poor English, Lee then sent him off to go corral Magruder and bring him back to the battlefield. So everything on this battle is going to be simple. We're just going to work with artillery, bombard the Union lines, and once it's softened up and neutralized, then the Confederate infantry would attack. How hard can that be? Next slide. At 2:30, Stonewall Jackson notified his lead division under Chase Whiting to put their artillery in the middle of the Poindexter farm and commence the action. Chase Whiting had reconnoitered that ground with the idea of putting artillery out there, also with the idea of having 100 guns out there going into action simultaneously. At that particular moment at 2:30, he had 2 batteries ready, so 8 guns, a far cry from 100. Chase Whiting couldn't believe what Stonewall Jackson had just asked him to do. In fact, he protested right on the spot. I understood we were not to enter the field until at least 50 guns arrived. These few guns will be destroyed within 5 minutes of entering the field. Stonewall Jackson tersely answered him, "Obey your orders willingly and promptly," to which Whiting said, "I always obey my orders promptly, but I do not obey these willingly." Lee or Jackson still insisted that they push into the field and do it immediately. The problem with that is you can see where the Poindexter farm is. There's only one road that leads into it, and it goes through a forest. There are 2 gates to the Poindexter farm, one right at the Willis Church Road and one right at the point where it enters the open field. All of this creates a choke point that will not enable the Confederates to bring anything significant out there simultaneously. So everything's going to trickle into the field at best. As soon as the first 2 batteries entered the field, Carter Berkeley, a member of the Stanton Artillery, wrote, "As soon as we unlimbered our guns, all the Yankee batteries on the hill beyond stopped firing on the woods and poured into us the most deadly fire that I have ever witnessed during the war. In a few minutes, men and horses were killed and wounded, guns were dismounted, and caissons exploded. The battery on our right, I do not think fired a shot. Before they got into battery, they were almost annihilated." things never got better than that. Instead of getting 100 guns into that field, the Confederates never were able to get more than 16 guns into that field at the same time. As soon as they brought a battery into the field, a battery was already being destroyed. So it turned into a nightmarish farce of an action. Stonewall Jackson was almost killed twice. A shell narrowly avoided taking off the head of his horse. It was only when Richard Ewell literally pulled on the reins of Jackson's horse and stopped him from riding right into the path of a shell that Jackson even bothered to notice. At another point, Jackson was standing next to his horse when a shell burst, frightening the little sorrel, who uncharacteristically bolted and dragged Jackson down to his knees and dragged him for about 30 yards before Jackson could gain control over the animal again. Jackson managed to live to tell about this but there were others who were also having near misses. Chase Whiting, his horse was hit by a shell and it collapsed on top of him. It took a while for his staff to even free him from the dead animal. Richard Ewell was almost hit by a shell. D.H. Hill was sitting under a tree writing an order when a shell burst right in front of him. It completely stitched through his uniform and tossed him on his side. Without any comment, he just simply got up and resumed his seat on the other side of the tree and continued to write. Things on the Poindexter farm were not very good, but things on the Carter's Mill Road were even worse. The Confederates never got more than 2 batteries into action ever on that position by Benjamin Huger. At one point, a well-renowned Virginia battery led by Willie Pegram went into that field. They lost in about 10 minutes, 20 men, 20 horses, and 3 of their 4 guns were knocked out of commission. It was terrible. So this was a pretty paltry expression of Confederate artillery. And the other thing that is remarkable about it is that the Confederates never had more than 20 guns ever engaged on the entire battlefield when they had been talking about having up to 160 guns pound the Union position. One of the greatest problems of this was that Lee neglected to ever confer with his chief of reserve artillery, William Nelson Pendleton. Now, Granny Pendleton was not the most remarkable of soldiers and tells one of the most amazing stories of Malvern Hill. He said that bringing his artillery forward, and it amounted to about 60 guns, he couldn't find Robert E. Lee. He said that he looked around, decided that he was unneeded because Lee had not sent for him, and then put everybody into camp so that they could rest their horses and water them. Granny Pendleton himself said, or he said that he himself had come forward to reconnoiter and got within earshot of the battle going on, but still didn't feel that his guns were necessary and never did seek out Lee, and blamed it the other way around, that Lee never sought him out instead. To go along with this egregious error and oversight, the artillery that belonged to D.H. Hill's division and the artillery that belonged to John Bankhead Magruder and all of Longstreet's guns and A.P. Hill's guns were still left to the rear. Many of those guns had, under D.H. Hill, been used at White Oak Swamp the day before. Longstreet's guns and A.P. Hill's had been used at Glendale, but still, on a day where artillery was paramount, their absence was noticeable. So clearly things weren't working. The plan, as stated, was that the artillery had to succeed before any infantry attack could go forward. The artillery had not succeeded. And by 3 p.m., Lee changed the plan. He decided that there would be no more fighting at Malvern Hill on July 1st. The artillery couldn't do the work. D.H. Hill said that the dismal performance was most farcical to look at. So Lee dismissed the idea of attacking Malvern Hill altogether. He went off and resumed his reconnaissance beyond Stonewall Jackson's left flank, looking to turn the Union position or the right flank of McClellan's army, not on July 1st, but relying on Longstreet and A.P. Hill to turn the position on July 2nd. So he was just prepping for the next day. Next slide. But at 4 p.m., just an hour later, Robert E. Lee changed his mind again. That's because he received two messages, one from John Bankhead Magruder and one from Chase Whiting, the two people shown here on your map. Magruder's rider found Robert E. Lee out beyond the Poindexter farm and announced that Lewis Armistead's brigade had had some success in reaching the hill. Actually, what had happened was that Lewis Armistead recognized that the artillery in front of him on the Carter's Mill Road were an absolute mess. Union skirmishers, particularly the Berdan sharpshooters, went forward to threaten those guns or menace those guns. At that point, the Confederates charged them to drive them back into their own lines. Three of Armistead's regiments managed to chase them halfway across the open fields to get to the very base of Malvern Hill. And then they got themselves stuck or trapped in no man's land, unable to go forward and unable to go back. Magruder reported that they had made a lodgment on Malvern Hill. Now, granted, it was the bottom of the hill, not the top of the hill, but it was definitely misleading. And with Robert E. Lee being far away beyond the Poindexter farm, he was unable to see it. So he had to go by the report of those who witnessed it and assumed that a lodgment meant that they had made it to the top of the hill, not the bottom of the hill. This was further muddled and confirmed almost by a messenger that came from Chase Whiting, almost right behind Magruder's messenger. Whiting's messenger said that they reported the Union forces on the top of the hill under General Couch were abandoning their positions and falling back. In truth, the artillery fire from the Confederates had been negligible, but it was still something that was between artillery units, not between infantry and artillery units. The Union infantry commander decided to move his troops to the reverse slope and let the artillery fight among themselves. Just pulling back in front of Chase Whiting, the message came that the Union Army was retreating. So Lee feared that the double whammy of Armistead making a lodgment on the hill and the Union forces apparently abandoning the hill, that McClellan was in retreat again, and that Lee feared that they would get away without much loss. So he ordered John Bankhead Magruder to attack Malvern Hill at once. At that particular moment that Magruder's messenger came back saying Lee wants you to attack immediately, Magruder also received the late Chilton's undated, untimestamped order saying that he was supposed to charge with a yell and do it at once. Both these things showing up at exactly the same time, Magruder felt that he was being admonished by Robert E. Lee. In fact, he had been rebuked earlier in the week for his lack of aggressiveness at Savage Station. So he was determined to be very aggressive on July 1st now. And he ordered a general assault. But the truth of the whole matter is that Lee relied on Magruder's judgment to decide on the practicality of an assault. Later, he would condemn Magruder for launching the attack that he did, asking him point blank, General Magruder, why did you attack? And Magruder's only answer was because he was following orders, without taking any responsibility for those orders were largely driven by his observations. Next slide. So at 5 p.m., the Confederates launched their first major attack. And that is going to be Armistead's troops, not only the ones that had been in the middle of the field trapped there for the day, but which you can see at the number 2 in the middle of your map, but they were going to be joined by the tremendously hairy Ambrose Ransom Wright on the right-hand side of your map, and equally hairy but diminutive figure of little Billy Mahone. These 3 brigades are going to launch Magruder's attack. And it's interesting because not one of these commanders is part of Magruder's command. They all come from Benjamin Huger's division. Benjamin Huger had lost most of his control over Lewis Armistead and Ransom Wright because they had gotten to the field without him and well before him, and established themselves almost as an autonomous unit. But he still had command over William Mahone and over Robert Ransom's brigade. So when Magruder cavalierly gave those 2 generals orders to come forward, Huger stepped in and warned Ransom and Mahone to ignore Magruder's orders, saying that they were supposed to obey orders only from him and no one else. Ransom chose to obey his own division commander and sat still. Mahone chose not to obey his commander, and he went forward. So the first major attack is 3 brigades of Confederates. They went charging across this open field with a rebel yell, and were instantly bombarded by an entire line of Union artillery on the top of the hill. Ambrose Wright went too far ahead of the others and got pinned down at about 300 yards in front of the Union line, unable to go forward or come back. Elements of Armistead's brigade tried no less than 6 different attacks to seize the crest. They never got close. The entire thing was an abysmal failure. Next slide. D.H. Hill's division was located in the woods between the Carter's Mill Road and the Willis Church Road. And by 5 o'clock, they had come to the conclusion that the artillery had not done its job and there would be no attack that day. The generals all gathered with D.H. Hill, and he ordered them to go disperse and pick out their bivouacs for the night. No sooner had the generals started moving away from their meeting spot when they heard an unexpected cheer rising off to the far right beyond the Carter's Mill Road. And then immediately beyond that, they heard the overwhelming and distinct sound of heavy combat. Incredible as it may seem, they heard the Armistead Wright Mahone Brigade attack. Instantly, they recognized the signal for the general assault. D.H. Hill whirled around to Stonewall Jackson and asked him what to do. And the only thing Jackson could tell him is that he needed to obey his orders. Nobody had rescinded the orders. So attack with a cheer was still the standing order. At that point, D.H. Hill ordered all the brigade commanders to mobilize as quickly as possible and move forward at once. There were 5 brigades in D.H. Hill's division. They had 8,200 men. If they had managed to mass all 5 brigades and launch an impressive attack, it would have probably been the biggest attack of the day and had the weight that no other attack would have had. So this was arguably the best effort that the Confederates had. Unfortunately, they were playing catch up. And instead of launching a massive attack with 5 brigades, they launched 5 smaller 1 brigade attacks. Each one went in piecemeal, one at a time. 5 brigades, 5 attacks, 5 failures. Colonel John B. Gordon, shown down in the lower left, was making his debut as a brigade commander at Malvern Hill. He had just taken over for the sick and weakened Robert Emmett Rhodes and led his brigade forward. Gordon was almost killed several times. In fact, he had 7 bullets through his uniform before the end of the day, and not one had touched his skin. At another point, a shell burst directly in front of him and threw sand directly into his eyes, temporarily blinding him. And he considered that in that moment that he was more panic stricken than ever in his life with the idea that he would be blind for life. Fortunately, his sight came back to him before he had to turn over command. His brigade didn't fare much better. The 3rd Alabama Infantry lost 37 members killed. They had 163 who were wounded and 6 color bearers who were killed taking their flag forward. That amounted to 56% of the entire regiment. 56%. That was the single highest loss of any unit on the field at Malvern Hill. D.H. Hill's overall division lost almost 1,800 of their 8,000 men. 1,800 out of 8,000. It was a disaster. Next slide. So things should have ended there, except Magruder launched a 3rd attack. On top of this, he advanced the rest of his command, again, piecemeal, starting with asking for the rest of UG's command, which led UG to storm in between them, and that led to a quarrel over the chain of command that prevented Ransom from coming forward in a timely manner and joining the others. Lee, by this point, had returned to the field and tried to make sense of the disaster that was already unfolding, and also tried to restore some kind of order over the chaos in Magruder's line. But Magruder felt the necessity to redeem himself even more as things were going wrong, and then advanced his own division. He moved 2 brigades under General Howell Cobb, the large fellow to the lower left, and William Barksdale of Mississippi on the right, the former congressman who just a couple of months before had been asked by his entire regiment to resign as a disgrace. Now he was commanding the entire brigade and taking it into battle for the first time. Barksdale's attack lost 1/3 of their entire command in about 20 minutes of combat. Howell Cobb's men didn't do much better. One of his units, the 2nd Louisiana Infantry, lost their colonel. They lost their lieutenant colonel. They had 182 casualties and lost 3 color bearers, which put them just behind the 3rd Alabama as the 2nd highest loss of any unit going forward at Malvern Hill. Next slide. So Robert E. Lee ordered a 4th attack. This time he ordered UG to release Robert Ransom and send him forward, ostensibly to be supporting for General Barksdale, or Colonel Barksdale at that time. But by the time Ransom was able to move forward, Barksdale was already out of action. So Ransom went forward alone to assail the Union far left. As you look at the map, you will see a house at the lower left of the Union line. That is the crew house, and there are heavy ravines immediately to the left of that, and you can see Turkey Run at the very bottom on the far left of the map. The Confederates along the slope of that ravine are Ransom's brigade. 4 regiments of North Carolinians, they became separated in the woods trying to get to that ravine. At one point, the 26th North Carolina, led by the future governor Zebulon Vance, couldn't find the rest of their brigade. He couldn't find anybody. At one point, in desperation, he accosted a Confederate skulker at sword point and demanded that he guide him to the battle. The skulker did it under penalty of death, but did it rather slowly, as you can well imagine. The 2 lead regiments under Robert Ransom and his brother Matt Ransom attacked without anybody else helping them. They managed to get into the yard of the crew farm. They got within 40 yards of the federal line before they were stopped and driven backwards. As other units showed up, they tried their attack again and again. And by the 4th time, when they stumbled back down into the ravine, the overall brigade of about 1,100 to 1,200 men had lost 500 of them. It was the single highest loss of any brigade at Malvern Hill. Next slide. And then there was a fifth assault. This time, the division of David R. Jones moved forward with their 2 brigades under the fellow on the left, George T. Anderson of Georgia, and the fellow on the right in the dark suit, Robert Toombs of Georgia. These 2 brigades going forward together probably would not have made any difference over everything else that had already transpired. But these 2 brigades advanced simultaneously. They advanced a quarter mile apart from each other. And that was because they wound up splitting and taking orders from 2 different generals. Both Magruder and Longstreet had sent these brigades in opposite directions. So one went out to the far left of the battlefield and the other went out to the far right of the battlefield. G.T. Anderson, or Tige Anderson as his nickname was, found out that his brigade straddled a wood line and the open field at the Crew Farm. Those in the field made quick, easy progress, while those in the swamps kind of lingered behind. But those in the field also were the first ones pinned down, and those in the swamp managed to actually get beyond them and further to the front. They never saw each other. So the left and the right of their brigade completely lost each other and wound up on either side of Barksdale's survivors. Tige Anderson wound up discovering one of his regiments, the 11th Georgia, had lost their colonel when the colonel just simply disappeared off the field. Tige Anderson wound up getting off his horse and leading the regiment in an assault himself. So instead of being a brigade commander, he opted to be a regimental commander. Lived to tell about it, but did not make any kind of dent in the progress of the battle. Robert Toombs did even worse. In the process of going to the front, Toombs proceeded to lose his entire brigade. He managed to get himself lost, and then he wound up losing a war of words when he ran into D.H. Hill. D.H. Hill had found his Georgians wandering aimlessly in the woods and co-opted them to go support his already failed assault, trying to help out John Brown Gordon and the others. When Toombs objected, D.H. Hill immediately yelled at him in front of what troops had gathered by saying, "For shame, General, rally your troops. Where were you when I was riding up and down your line? Rally your troops, sir." Robert Toombs was a congressman who was not used to being spoken that way. And after the battle, challenged D.H. Hill to a duel, to which D.H. Hill just laughed at him and disregarded him. The attack, obviously, was a miserable failure. Next slide. And this led to a 6th assault. This time, the division of General Lafayette McLaws came forward and were personally directed by Lee to where they were supposed to go in and make their attack. 2 brigades came forward, South Carolinians under Joseph Brevard Kershaw on the left and Paul Semmes on the right. These units had not seen a lot of action, but they had lost a lot of men. Kershaw's brigade, for example, had 3,500 men at the beginning of the week. When they went forward at Malvern Hill, they only had about 1,500 of those 3,500. So less than 50%. Kershaw barely made it out beyond the parsonage before he got pinned down. Paul Semmes did a lot better. He managed to join elements of Rand's Wright's Georgia Brigade and Lewis Armistead's men still pinned down on the slope and press all the way to the top of the hill, as shown in this, this sketch, showing you the Crew House immediately in front of you and the West House in the background on the right. Paul Semmes' men managed to get to the Union line. They were the only Confederates who got to the Confederate line. And to be more precise, only a small segment of Paul Semmes' brigade got to the Union line. a tiny segment of the 10th Louisiana Infantry managed to penetrate up into the Union artillery line and get in among the cannons for a brief moment before they were met by a counterattack led by the Irish Brigade that drove them backwards and resealed the line. The Confederates never really had a chance at Malvern Hill, and this story would be easy to just make into a great Confederate tragedy. The Union Army seemed to hold all the cards, but that's not necessarily true. The Union troops that you see on the crest by the two houses are troops that are part of Morrell's division, and particularly Charles Griffin's brigade immediately in the foreground. Charles Griffin had probably the coolest nickname of any Union general. He was called the King of the War Dogs because the dogs of war are artillery, and he had been the artillery instructor at West Point when the war broke out. So the King of the War Dogs was now leading infantry and artillery on the crest of the hill. Griffin lost over 500 men. He lost 534 men on top of that hill. He lost 3 of his 4 regimental commanders in this action on the hill. And the 62nd Pennsylvania, which are right there in the foreground for you, they lost 5 color bearers in the process of the fight for that crest. The chief of all Union artillery, or they're all reserve artillery, was Henry Jackson Hunt. General Hunt is familiar to most of you. He was then Colonel Hunt in 1862. He had 2 horses shot out from under him at Malvern Hill. So wasn't the safest place in the world to be a Union officer, but certainly they fared much better than the Confederates did in comparison. The Confederates failed in 6 assaults. They almost launched a 7th. Richard Ewell's division started moving forward on Stonewall Jackson's front, and Stonewall Jackson confronted the lead brigade under Isaac Ridgway Trimble, one of the most aggressive officers in either army. And intercepting Trimble, Jackson just said that he should stop and better not try it. Trimble had to obey the order and backed off. In truth, there's a reason why Jackson wasn't interested in continuing this fight. Not only was the assault beyond redemption, but that the Confederates had spent so many troops attacking the slopes that most of the Confederate army was in utter disarray. Richard Ewell was one of the few divisions that had not been engaged yet, and if the Union Army should ever counterattack, might be the only defense for the entire Army of Northern Virginia. As it was, they didn't need Richard Ewell's division. The Union Army never did counterattack. As the 6th assault failed and Paul Semmes's men fell back down the hill, it was 8:30 at night, and the last shots had already been fought. Next slide. The casualties were pretty significant at Malvern Hill. The Confederates lost 5,650 men, 5,650. It amounted to literally 28% of all Confederate losses in the 7 days battle. It also corresponds to about 20,300 Confederates who made the attacks at Malvern Hill. So it also amounts to 28% of all attackers who came up against Malvern Hill wound up as casualties. For the Union Army, they had smaller losses, but not significantly smaller losses. While the Confederates lost 5,600, the Union Army lost a little better than 3,000, 3,007. And that amounted to 19% of all Union losses in the 7 days battles. So this is, in many ways, one of the biggest of all the 7 days battles. Only Gaines' Mill had a higher percentage of loss than Malvern Hill, but this one was decidedly lopsided. Next slide. The Union Army knew that they had pretty well bested the Confederates at Malvern Hill. They knew that the Confederates had committed their troops and had destroyed many of them on the slopes of the hill. For people like Fitzjohn Porter and the division commander from New Jersey, Philip Kearny, they saw this as the opportune moment to change the fortunes of the 7 days. They were ready to start a counterattack on the morning of July 2nd that would drive the Confederates back into their defenses and perhaps even seize Richmond. They were both thwarted and dismayed when McClellan ordered a withdrawal that night to Harrison's Landing on the James River, 8 miles away. Fitzjohn Porter sought out McClellan personally to appeal to him. I was unable to sway the general and had to obey the order. Phil Kearny was a division commander who often spoke his mind and spoke out of turn and gave us one of his most lethal views of the war at this point. When he was ordered to retreat, he spoke in front of a group of Third Corps officers saying, I, Philip Kearny, an old soldier, enter my solemn protest against this order for retreat. I say to you all, such an order can only be prompted by cowardice or treason. Nonetheless, they had to obey the order, and they abandoned the top of Malvern Hill, the last to go, right before dawn on July 2nd. The only thing that helped and hindered the retreat was that a tremendous nor'easter pounded Virginia that morning and dropped several inches of rain, turning the dirt roads into an absolute quagmire. Perhaps it was right that McClellan left when he did. During the course of the 7 days, he lost 500 wagons. He lost 1/3 of them just on July 2nd. Next slide. But the federal troops were able to make it down to Harrison's Landing and get under the safety of the U.S. Navy's guns. Part of the reason was that the Confederates did not pursue. Robert E. Lee met the morning of July 2nd with General James Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson, and they were joined by no less a person than the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. The meeting was stilted and awkward. Longstreet was probably the most optimistic person in the entire meeting. And his assessment of the situation is, I think you hurt them as much as they hurt you. And that's about the best they could have said for their performance at Malvern Hill. Stonewall Jackson was cold because he didn't like Jefferson Davis. He was barely civil, and Davis wasn't much better. In the end, all of them had to concede that the rain would prevent them from ever catching up with McClellan's retreating army, and that McClellan was beyond hurting now. Rain ultimately ended the campaign. Next slide. The federal perceptions of what had happened in the 7 days and at Malvern Hill was kind of hard to gauge. There are a number who were at loss to say whether the 7 days or Malvern Hill was a victory or a defeat. They had clearly hurt the Confederates at Malvern Hill, but they had also conceded the ground and gave it up. Further afield from the Army of the Potomac, Republicans, and particularly radical Republicans, blamed the debacle on McClellan for retreating from victory. McClellan, for his point of view, blamed the, quote, heartless villains in Washington for not supporting his army and giving him the necessary reinforcements to capture Richmond at that time. Democrats decided that they would blame the War Department and the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, for being less than cooperative in trying to finish the war before it radicalized. Next slide. Confederate perceptions were also a little bit muddied, but not nearly as muddied as Union perception. Robert E. Lee was terribly disappointed that he had not achieved more for his effort in the 7 days and at Malvern Hill. He wrote to his wife, "Our success has not been as great as I could have desired." In his official report, Lee stated, "Under ordinary circumstances, the Federal Army should have been destroyed, but clearly it had not." D.H. Hill believed that the Confederates were beaten in detail. He said it was not war, it was murder. And Confederate soldiers feared that they had been bested. Leroy Wesley Cox of the Charlottesville Artillery, shown here at the top left, wrote, "Take it as a whole, we got the worst of it at Malvern Hill." And their losses were just the tip of the iceberg. Their grief would extend all across the land. Captain David Poe of the 25th Virginia, shown at the top right, wrote afterwards, "The suffering endured by the soldiers during those 7 days of blood and carnage was not all the suffering endured by the American people. Think of the widows and the orphans and the vacant chairs that were made during that fearful week just to satisfy the whims of a few giddy cranks north and south." Lee blamed his subordinates for their poor performance. He had 6 major generals that served under him. He removed 3 of the 6 from his army. So no longer would the Army of Northern Virginia have the likes of a John Bankhead Magruder or a Theophilus Holmes or a Benjamin Huger. But the Confederates had won in spite of their efforts. And they had won because McClellan had retreated from Malvern Hill after winning a critical battle victory. McClellan's actions, believe it or not, helped to escalate the war in exactly the direction that McClellan wanted to avoid at all costs, because the war escalated from being a rebellion into a full-blown revolution. Prior to the battle, Southerners were secessionists, but they still identified themselves as Virginians or Carolinians or Georgians. It was rare that you would find them call themselves Confederates. Following the 7 days, the Confederates are going to be a common term. The Confederacy itself was a reality now. It had secured itself against a direct threat to its capital. It had defended itself and made it invulnerable for at least the next 3 years. It created a legitimacy to the Confederate government, not only at home, but abroad. And at this point, support for the Confederate war effort broadened among Southerners. But that said, the Confederates were scarred by their victory by default. Next slide. Almost precisely 1 year later, and a dozen battles wiser, Southern soldiers again stood poised on a July afternoon, preparing for a monumental assault against a Union salient, this time Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. And you know the motivation of the Union defenders at Gettysburg when they met Pickett's charge, crying, "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg." But I leave you with a couple of ideas of quotes that reveal where the Southern thoughts and fears hearkened from on July 3rd, 1863. Next slide. Captain Joseph Graham of the Charlottesville Artillery, top left. "I fear then I could see a want of resolution in our men, and I heard many say that it was worse than Malvern Hill. And I don't hardly think that position can be carried, etc., etc., enough to make me apprehensive of the results." Lieutenant James F. Crocker, 9th Virginia Infantry on the right, talked to Louis Armistead before this attack began at Gettysburg. "He told me that it was to be another Malvern Hill, another costly day for Virginia and for Virginians." It is interesting to note that the Confederate fear did not come from the bloodiest day of the war at Sharpsburg or Antietam, nor from Fredericksburg or Chancellorsville or Second Manassas or Cedar Mountain, from a disruptive little hill in Henrico County, Virginia, where Lee lost a battle and won a victory, and where McClellan won a battle and lost an army by retreating from victory. Malvern Hill. Thanks. Okay. Appreciate you guys going through this epic with me.
So Frank, we thank you very much. We have a number of questions.
Great.
So if I could start taking you through them. One is, did the battlefield look like it does today if you visit it?
Great news. It's one of the great battlefield preservation success stories. When I started visiting the battlefield years ago, there was a tiny postage stamp of ground preserved with the National Park Service right on the crest where the Union artillery was at the crew farm. Today, through the help of the Richmond Battlefield Partners and with the American Battlefield Protection Program and the American Battlefields Trust, most of the battlefield is preserved and protected today. What had been consumed by woods was opened up again, and those vast open fields are vast and open again. I'm happy to report that the postage stamp has now been replaced by a battlefield hike that literally can go 8 miles around the whole course of the battlefield. It's spectacular.
That's great. We have a question. How many artillery pieces did the Union forces use, and what percentage of the casualties did they inflict?
Great question. The Union artillery used directly on the assaults at the north part of the salient were 60 pieces. In the process of the day, many of the batteries literally fired everything they had and had to be replaced by other batteries. They didn't come up with the happy idea of just bringing more ammunition to those in front, but just replacing them as whole batteries. The artillery was inflicted at least 2/3 of all the casualties on the battlefield. That was the reckoning of D.H. Hill, who did a pretty careful study of this afterwards and wrote several pieces, including a couple that were published for Century Magazine and got into things like battles and leaders.
Another question we have from one of our members, it says your sketches of the battlefield were fantastic. Did they come from one source or several, in terms of the research you've done?
Oh, great. The sketches came from many different sources. I was pulling from some of the Walton Tabor sketches from Battles and Leaders to Frank Leslie's Illustrated News for a couple of the assaults. And then there was the one color assault that we used for Semmes attack at the very end when we talked about Griffin. That was a piece that was commissioned for the North Carolina historian Louis Mannering when he did a history of Henrico County in the Civil War. So yeah, there's some wonderful art that's surrounding this battle. In fact, I think this battle gets more sketches and more art around it than any of the other 7 days.
Yeah, I've got one of them up behind me, actually.
Yes, Robert Sneeden,
Yep.
Great sketch.
Now, Robert E. Lee was brand new to command. And what role did his sheer newness to command and to the Army have on how the 7 days played out?
Robert E. Lee is very new to this job, and he's going to make a bunch of rookie mistakes. Not the least of which is writing an order that is nonsensical, abdicating all responsibility for combat on the battlefield to a brigadier like Lewis Armistead. If Lewis Armistead was in a position where he could judge whether they should make an attack or not, that should have been Lee's command post, so he could make that call. It never once dawned on him to go over to that part of the field until very late in the day when he directed Lafayette McLaw's final assaults. So he is He also made a number of mistakes in creating a very small staff that surrounded him that could not keep him perpetually informed or be his factotum out on the battlefield. After the battle, the great thing that you can say about leadership qualities is that Lee did a harsh assessment of his subordinates, but he also did a harsh assessment of himself. He was going to fundamentally change his command way of directing, starting with let's not come up with complex plans where 3 or 4 or 5 columns have to all converge at the point of combat. Let's simplify the plans. Let's work with something that can be executed in reality instead of just a blueprint that's going to fail when it's actually put to the test. So he's going to simplify a lot of his motions and his assaults from that point out. Even Stonewall Jackson making a flank attack at Chancellorsville is going to be relatively simpler than what he was asking of his subordinates in the 7 days. The other thing is that they're going to make a professional staff. They're going to start using staff officers and training them to be better. The irony in all of this is the one that failed Lee the worst, Robert Chilton, is the one that's going to still stick with him. I'm not sure exactly what that says of their relationship, but Chilton will go on to make other gaffes as he goes along as well.
So you mentioned McClellan had left Malvern Hill earlier in the day. Was he ever back there during the course of the battle?
Good question. He was a great non-entity in the combat. He did leave early in the day, came back very late in the afternoon. Never once approached John Porter's line. He stayed out on the far Union right flank, very close to the river. Arguably, that might have been the place that he should have been in for a couple of reasons. One is that was exactly where Lee was looking with his reconnaissance. So both generals were suspecting maybe the Union right flank was the weak link. But the other thing that keep in mind with McClellan is that McClellan never once considered himself to be a battlefield manager. He was the one who merely had to set the table and get the generals in the right spot and let them do their thing. In a sense, he was delegating that authority for the combat, which he had done at Mechanicsville and Gaines Mill, Glendale, and what he would go on to do at South Mountain and Antietam. But Malvern Hill was really no different. The troubling part is that even when the fighting did become obviously directed against John Porter, McClellan still opted to stay very close to Samuel Heintzelman, who was a non-entity. After the fact, as you all remember, McClellan ran for president against Lincoln in 1864. And it's at that point that some of the more outlandish cartoons lampooned him sitting on the deck of a gunboat sipping lemonade while the battle was going on. But that couldn't possibly be any kind of political bias there at all. That's a good documentation there.
So we have a question from, did I understand that the Confederate goal was to push the Union troops south? And if so, why set artillery on the Poindexter farm to the west?
Okay, very good question. The idea is to be able to rupture the Union position on the hill, and ostensibly when the Union troops are routed from that position, you could destroy them on the cliff, the reverse slope, and in the bottoms towards the river if the Confederates could put their artillery up on top of that hill and then fire down on them. The idea of putting artillery on the Poindexter farm and on the UG's front by the Carter farm was the idea that they would be able to create angles where they could converge their fire on one point, the tip of that mule shoe. Here I'm using a Spotsylvania term, the tip of a salient. The idea is also by having Confederates converging from two different areas of fire, that Union defenders in the middle will be compelled to disperse their fire to meet them. So even though the Union have a strong central location with lots of guns, if the targets are spread out, that would spread out their fire as well. At least that was the thought. Turns out with the Confederates only showing up in bits and pieces, it was very easy to smother them one at a time.
Yeah, when you mentioned Lee starts directing these attacks late in that afternoon, but by then he knows Magruder hasn't established, or Armistead hasn't gotten a foothold. He knows the Union is not retreating. So is there any indication what he's thinking of with those final assaults, given the futility of the earlier ones?
Yeah, that is a confusing one. And what is happening at that point with Lee is that his army has already been committed, in fact, overcommitted to the fighting by the time he catches up with it. You're looking at now 3 to 4 divisions that have already been sliced up. And there is a dread fear that this will induce the Union Army to counterattack. For the Confederates, it was difficult for them to attack Malvern Hill because they had to get between 2 streams. So they were just coming right up an alleyway, right up the middle. Theoretically, the Confederates should have been able to also block that alleyway and make it defensible the other way around. But Union forces were up on top of a big open hill. They had plenty of places that they could marshal forces for a storming unit. The Confederates were coming out of heavy woods and swamps. They were unable to find themselves. And as we've talked about several of the attacks where brigades literally split up and commanders couldn't find their men because they were in swamps, it would have been virtually impossible for them to build a viable defense line in that swamp. So Lee's answer was to work with the only thing he had. He had the initiative. So he was going to run with the initiative until the day ran out. In one sense, he was trading lives for time, and time ostensibly for the life of the army itself.
Well, one is very appropriate as a final question. Was taps written during the encampment of McClellan's troops?
It was. Once they got to Harrison's Landing, one of the less exceptional Union generals had a camp right there at the Harrison House, Berkeley, and his name was Daniel Butterfield. Butterfield was a militia general from New York who his father had made a ton of money basically creating part of the Pony Express and a lot of the money that went into Western expansion. The Wells Fargo is a good example of Butterfield money. The Butterfield himself was something of an amateur musician, decided in one of his more relaxing moments to try to write a bugle sign for the end of the day, for the lights out, and brought in a bugler from the 83rd Pennsylvania Infantry to practice with him. And they together created what we know as taps. Butterfield might not have been a very good general, but he did give us 2 great legacies. He gave us that beautiful, haunting piece of music, and he also gave us corps badges that eventually became what we use today with every division of the United States Army having their own distinctive badge.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up. I want to thank you very much, Frank, as always. Fascinating. And I wanted to remind everybody, May 11th will be our next presentation.
Thanks, everybody. You guys have been great. And I applaud all of you. You are everything that is right with the Civil War community and how you all blend together and stick together, no matter what the trials and tribulations are. You are an exceptional army unto yourselves. You adapt and improvise and overcome. And I think you guys are the greatest.
Well, thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.